So I am resuming recording now. Buckle up. So hello again, it's Jessica Pettit. I am super excited to do this training because, in full disclosure, this is actually one of my favorite things I've gotten to do even since like the late 1900s, when I would have conversations with people specifically about gender. And back then, sometimes now, but still definitely back then, folks would come up to me and say, like, can you explain this gender thing, but like keep it super basic? And I would say, yeah, sure, sit down, and then completely not keep it basic at all. But what I found out was that, or what I discovered, I guess, is that as people wanted it to be basic, what they wanted it to be is some kind of, like, for lack of better words, like extra sprinkles on the frosting of them being an ally. So if they could just know like a few new vocabulary words or something, that would be super. Except they asked me. So by virtue of asking me, I have to get into systems of oppression and how this works with sex, how this works with gender, how this works with sexual orientation. Where does sexism and heterosexism show up? And then, fun facts, at that intersection, we have racism and ageism and all different kinds of ableism and access, and all kinds of things are happening at once. So that's what we're in for today. So even though we're talking about gender, I want to make sure, again, the texting number, if you have any questions or comments, you're welcome to text 202-670-4262. I'm going to be going through a model that I created along with some colleagues. You might want to draw along, so you are welcome to grab a pen and paper if you haven't already. I probably trained you on pen and paper last time, but just in case, feel free. You do not have to draw along, but you are welcome to. The idea really was, if the people were interested enough to ask me for the basics, how could I present the basics as the entry point to a much more complex conversation? Because I think at the heart of the complex question is a real basic understanding of what is biology and anatomy, and what is the social construction of gender, and how basically everything we live is based on the social construction of gender. We just say it's based on sex. Unless you have very specific medical related things, that might be related to sex, but almost everything else is related to gender. And then to make it even more fun, we aren't allowed to talk about it. We don't talk about gender performance. We certainly don't talk about sex and anatomy, but we don't talk about this kind of uniform situation that happens. So then when we try to be allies specifically to gender nonconforming or trans folks, things begin to fall apart because we have to first acknowledge our own assumptions. So I wanted to be able to create this model, and at the center of it again is, I believe we are responsible for doing our own work. Often when I would do LGBT ally trainings like we did last time, heterosexual folks would come and like learn, right, about the others, and then us gay, lesbian, bisexual, pansexual, omnisexual, queer, fluid, asexual people never really felt part of the conversation. So I want to encourage you today to realize that you probably have an anatomy, you probably have some biological makeup. If you don't, that's a very different workshop, but I'm pretty sure you do. So whatever your anatomical construction bits are, that's one thing. I'm from the South, and as a woman from the South, there are some anatomical parts and pieces I didn't actually know what they looked like until I went to some woo-woo workshop when I was almost menopausal. So I just want to be mindful that there may be things that are in your body you've never seen. There may be things on the outside of your body that you may or may not be familiar with. Some of you are very familiar, and that's fine. When we start talking about gender, though, it's not that stuff, but you are part of this conversation. When we start talking about gender, you have to take responsibility for your roles, your identity, and your expression, but also how you perceive other people's gender. And then, just to tie it all together, when we start talking about sexual orientation, straight identified people, welcome, you have one too. So until we can start finding our place in this conversation, we can't actually have a conversation about being an ally. So that's why I think it's really important to start at self-reflection and responsibility. So, if we're going to do this education piece, some of you are not new to this conversation, but you are welcome to steal this because it is a great way to have a conversation with people who are very new. Those of you that are new, you don't have to out yourself unless you want to. Welcome. I talk about this stuff all the time. So, we start with a binary. Now, sometimes even just that is like you've already lost me. So, the idea of a binary is that there are only two options. So, what do you put on a hot dog? You are either a ketchup onion kind of person or you are a mustard relish kind of person. You might even have an opinion. For the record, mustard relish is correct. So, binary means there are only two options, and you are one of them, and everybody else is the other one. Now, you may also have friends that are part of your group, and you may occasionally be one of those kind of people that are friends with them. But just notice that we default to binary all the time. So we talked about this in the last workshop, is it's straight and not straight. And then within not straight is gay or lesbian and them. And then within them, it's like hurry up and pick a softball team, right? Because we need to have this binary because that's what we're comfortable with. Has nothing to do with reality, but it is super comfortable. So if that's the binary and we can actually like undo the binary assumptions that we make or the structure that we assume everything fits into a binary, then we actually could begin to engage in a conversation with our own complexities and someone else's complexities. So, like any model, there's usually a shape. I prefer a triangle. It's upside down as a shout out. So an upside down triangle is what we're going to work out with today. If you want to play along, feel free to draw a triangle. You're going to measure or label each corner sex, gender, and sexual identity. Now, already someone's like, why is she using the term sexual identity instead of sexual orientation? Because I'm the trainer. I will explain. I do not believe orientation really is what we're talking about. I think what we're really talking about is identity, and I will explain. So if you want to follow along, feel free to draw this on the triangle. Sex, gender, sexual identity. So we're going to start with sex, not the act of. It is a different workshop. We are going to start with anatomy and biology as referenced in sex. So normally when I do this in person, I might have people like call out, like, what are sex or anatomically characterized things? And then people label everything out. Almost always, when this binary system, the first thing that happens is genitalia. And we don't say the word genitalia, mostly because we don't know how to spell it. So what we say is penis. That comes up first. There's a joke there. And then what is partnered with the penis is, of course, the vagina, because we have this binary thing. So as we start doing anatomical biological pieces, I want you to notice that this binary column will happen. That we assume if you have a penis, you have these things, you have this thing, you have this thing. If you have a vagina, you have this thing, you have this thing, you have this thing. And that is how the world order works. That is not necessarily true for everyone, but that is what we like to pretend. So, and you're at work. We've already said penis and vagina, and no one blew up. So, next up is chromosomes. We like to think that there's only 2 sets of chromosomes, even though we have ample evidence that there's over 500 combinations of chromosomal makeups. We cannot be bothered by factoids. Let's stick to the basics. So we have 2 sets of chromosomes only that we think about, and they conveniently align with one that has a penis and one that has a vagina. Hormones. We like to think that there's only 2 hormones. False. We also like to think you only have one of them. Also false. Maybe. I don't know. I don't know what your hormonal makeup is. Testosterone and estrogen are 2 very important hormones, but that's only 2 of them. And what's fun about chromosomes and hormones is chances are you actually don't know what yours are. Unless you're having fertility, puberty, or menopausal issues in the US medical system, we don't actually test for this stuff all the time. Sometimes we do, especially in utero, but we don't always pass that message along. We just assume we know this information not only about ourselves, we assume we know this information about other people. Okay, then here's my medical training, innards. I'm not a medical person. I was a ceramics major. So innards or possibly giblets, depending on where you're from, they're the little bits and pieces that are inside of you that we think are anatomical related, right? So some people have a prostate. Do I have a prostate? I don't know. Do people have mammary glands? Some people do, sure, right? What about ovaries? What about testes? If you have testes and they've dropped, you're probably aware of those. But there are other things that are just floating around in our bodies that we don't know that we have until one, something's gone wrong, or two, we assume we have them. So that's what I mean by innards. Now, secondary sex characteristics are different. Secondary sex characteristics are DNA or genetically based, but they're interpreted in a different way. So what I mean by this is you think of your like family history, your genetic coding, right? So maybe you're a really hairy person. Well, in our society, if that hair is in the right place, way to go. But if that hair's in the wrong place, someone can make money off of that, right? So as a woman, I have one facial hair. I don't know when it comes until it is 19 feet long. I never notice it at a millimeter. I only notice it when I can like wrap my finger around it, and I take care of that in the wee hours of the morning, right? Some people have no shave November. Some people would like to have no shave November. I haven't shaved my legs since the 1900s. So hair is a thing, but we perceive what that means based on the genetics or the DNA disposition to body hair. Same thing goes with how high or how deep your voice is, how tall you got, how thin you got, where do you store your fat. What's fascinating about fat storage, goes back to hormones, is if your estrogen level is higher, you're more likely to store your fat on your chest and at your hips, right? So those often are called breasts and hips. If you happen to be a man type person, or we assume you're a man type person, and your estrogen level is relatively high, you're much more likely to store your fat on your chest or your hips, which we call like your pelvis. I don't know that men refer to themselves as having hips, except that's a thing, and man boobs. And man boobs and breasts are seen as very different things, even though they're really both just fat storage. Secondary sex characteristics are important to acknowledge because we perceive them. We perceive them and we write a whole story about them, and somehow we've kind of all agreed to that story. Now, when we flip to gender, if I were to ask you to call out things, we would be here for forever. So what I think is important is let's take, have you seen the phenomenon of eyelashes on a car? Have you seen this? Okay, so just for fun, you're welcome to use the chat, or I probably know what you're going to say. When you put eyelashes on your car's headlights, what gender does that make your car? This is a question in the United States right now. So everyone's like, it's a girl, right? Because men don't need body hair to keep foreign particles out of their eyeballs. Only women do. What is happening? Not to mention, a car does not actually have a sex or an anatomy or biological parts because it's a machine. But we don't care. You slap some eyelashes on it and that's a girl. So, wow, okay. Part of that is a different workshop of the valuation of what it means to be a girl or a woman in our society, or two, maybe what we do to our cars. Also a different conversation. What we're talking about there is gender because it has nothing to do with sex and anatomy. So when we start thinking about gender, I want you to think of 4 different elements. They spell ripe if you're going to steal this and do this later. So first is roles, identity, perception, and expression. Those are the 4. Roles, identity, perception, and expression. Now, what's weird is perception is the one you don't have any control over at all. Roles, identity, and expression are your outbound messages that you are sending out to other people, hoping maybe for validation, maybe someone will believe you in how you want to identify, how you're choosing to express yourself, what roles you are taking on. You are sending out messages to complete a story and hoping that someone will pick up your story and believe it to be true. That is where perception comes in. You're not responsible for how people perceive you because you have no control over it. But you are responsible for what little cues you use or need to validate or perceive someone else. When someone is giving you their story, you'll plinko through and look for a few things and either say, yep, that's true, affirmed, or you'll be like, that's adorable. No, you're not. right? And you'll invalidate their identities. Speaking of eyelashes, here's a list of things not to do. One of the first students I ever worked with who came out to me as a trans man, I actually responded, "Oh, Julie, that can't be true. You have beautiful eyelashes." Now we're back to the car, right? Don't say that, P.S. So that is what I said. I didn't know enough about what was going on. These are things not to say. You are allowed to learn things. So if roles, identity, and expression are under your control, and perception is the one that you can't make people do, but you can be responsible for what you do, those are the four very important pieces of gender. If you can understand those things, sex and gender, just that, you're already way ahead of the curve. Because some people get all wrapped around the axle here when we start talking about being a trans ally, and they get very worried about not knowing enough stuff. But that is the super basics. So I just want to pause, see if there's any thoughts, comments, or questions. You can either unmute yourself or you can chat them. Let me check my texts, because for some, this is a lot of information all at once. And that's kind of what I'm known for. Get what you pay for. Okay, I don't have any texts. I don't see any chats. I'm not hearing anyone unmuting. I am proceeding with caution. Great. So we've gone through sex. We've gone through gender. So next up is where intersex shows up. So some of you may be more familiar with the word hermaphrodite. That is a word that's generally not used anymore. And with that said, somebody somewhere has hermaphrodite pride. But the concept of hermaphrodite, this is where I get to be a dork, is that Hermes, the ideal man, and Aphrodite, the ideal woman, got together, one, were fertile, were heterosexual, attracted to each other, and had consensual sex, and had the ideal baby. And the ideal baby was the perfect blending of everything male and female. Notice I said male and female. Those are sex-based words. So the perfect blending of everything male and female anatomically would be someone who would then be diagnosed or determined to be a hermaphrodite. Because that got pathologized, folks in this community, largely due to the internet, began to find each other and started to refer to themselves as intersexed or someone with an intersex condition. So that's what the I stands for. Again, I'm from the South. I don't call anybody anything that ends in ED. So I don't like the term intersexed, and I'm not even somebody in this community, but I, of course, have an opinion. So I would say intersex condition. So that is what we would refer to someone who does not have perfectly aligned binary, anatomical, or biological bits and pieces that they know of. Now, inside the United States, people always want to know how many of these people exist. It's hard to know because it was actually considered good medical practice to intervene if a newborn's external genitalia did not measure up. Somebody somewhere, probably named Todd, came up with a ruler of how long a newborn's penis is supposed to be in order for them to be a functioning man in the world. I want that job so bad. So if an external genitalia baby has what looks like it could be a penis, except it was determined to be too small, the suffering that that poor little man baby would have as a grown-up was actually intervened, often without parental consent, and removed is the word that they would use to make it a clitoris. So what that means is that when this person actually starts going through puberty or fertility, they will then find out what their innards are, where their hormone levels are, maybe what their chromosomes are, maybe their testes drop, maybe they have testes and ovaries, maybe they had a really big clitoris and now they have a very small clitoris. Who knows? And most of this was done without parental consent. On average in the United States, this still happens about 1 in every 2,000 births. So there's a thing, right? So do you know, did you find out, did your parents tell you, or did you discover it because of medical or fertility reasons? That's why the internet's been so helpful in kind of formulating that community of what it means to actually have been surgically altered with or without parental consent as a child. So that is the I. Now, I talked a little bit about intersex condition, person with the intersex condition. That's usually the vernacular that's used. So on the other side, this is where the T shows up. So if the I is about biology and anatomy, then when we start talking about T, I use the word trans as an umbrella term, or gender nonconforming as an umbrella term. But trans started as transsexual, which is a term that generally was referred to when someone was seeking, or potentially just given against their will, actual surgeries that adjusted their external genitalia. This originally was to fix gay men, so we would turn gay men into straight women, even though foreshadowing, it's coming. Sexual orientation is not related to gender or sex, but we didn't know that at the time. So to fix the poor gay men, we would turn them into women, and they would identify as transsexual. Some people would seek this out. Not everybody wants to actually alter their physical bodies, and prior to Obamacare, not everybody had access to altering their physical bodies. So we started using the word transgender because it was actually a mutable thing of your gender and not dependent on hormones or external genitalia or medical intervention. Then, with the rollout of, or I guess rollback of a lot of those policies in the last 3 years, whether or not trans or gender nonconforming people can even access the health care that was provided for them is now up in the air, doctor to doctor, hospital to hospital, state to state. Trans or trans with an asterisk are often used as the umbrella term. Trans with the asterisk is a great example of how academics, usually white educated men cisgender and women cisgender, create language. Is the idea that trans with an asterisk was inclusive of everyone, and then people who didn't identify as academics were like, you're not even thinking about me. So language evolves. Welcome. So if you ever are like, I don't know what the right word is today, just Google it today because it could be different. But these are some good kind of basics to understand about the T. But it usually leads to questions about the cross-dresser, drag king, or drag queen. So you may be familiar with someone or a term that is transvestite or TV. There are still lots of conferences for very proud transvestites, and generally speaking, we don't use that word anymore either because it has also been kind of pathologized. The research or studies that were done to determine TV behaviors or cross-dresser behaviors were primarily on straight white men who would wear the quote other gender's clothing in very private circumstances for either emotional, spiritual, or sexual gratification. So that's where kind of the community evolved from. But generally speaking, a cross-dresser, the main thing you need to remember is that this is done in private. It is for them. Usually their partners or children or roommates or house pets don't know that they are doing this behavior. It is very private. Some of that is related to shame, and some of that is related to the actual gratification of the experience. It's up to the individual. However, if you are wearing the quote unquote other genders, notice the binary here. If you are wearing the other gender's clothing in a very public or very performative way, you might be called a drag queen or a drag king. Again, note the binary. So a drag king is a woman wearing men's clothing in a public performance, and a drag queen is a man wearing women's clothing in a public performance. Just to make things complicated, when I have done drag, I'm called a bio queen because I'm a relatively masculine, maybe androgynous kind of person. Let me be a masculine identified person, even if you don't identify me that way. But when I would perform in drag, I would wear like makeup and big hair and big boobs and glitter and all kinds of weird femmy stuff that I don't normally wear because it was a very performative thing. So in some ways, it's the other gender's clothing because it's not really what I wear, even though I'm actually a biological cisgender woman, in case you're taking notes. Okay. Gender variant, gender nonconforming, gender bender. These are all terms that often still get used to describe people who are not fitting into the binary gender system. They are either not fitting in because they're not perceived or they're not passing as gender binary, or that is actually their point. Usually they're pretty cool with themselves, but this binary gender system is what's jacked up, so they're not interested in performing inside of the binary for your consumption. So those are kind of where those words came from or what the motivation of those words were. So if that's sex, gender, intersex, and trans-related kind of communities, they fit on those two sides of the triangle. So well, I already talked about being cisgender, but just in case, again, why I'm not invited to parties, cis is a prefix meaning congruent. So how you were labeled and how you identify worked out okay, right? So it's congruent. So that's what cis means. That's what cisgender privilege is. I am a cis woman. You might be a cis man. We might be cis people. We could have a cis group, whatever. That's where that language kind of evolved from. Okay, so next up, sexual identity. I like to start with straight people just because you're included in this conversation too. So you have heterosexual, straight, gay, lesbian, bisexual, pansexual, omnisexual, queer, asexual. I have not been on Facebook in 31 minutes, so I don't know what new words are coming out. There are tons of new words. We create new words to describe either who we are or we create new words to describe who we aren't. That is literally how language develops. And full disclosure, I was walking around Pride. Remember walking like around people? I was walking around Pride last summer in June in Seattle, and I do this for a living. I am a giant queer lesbiterian, right? So I should have the full encyclopedia of all languages because let me tell you, first off, anyone younger than me does not want to hear any of my like LGBT activism. Don't roll out your resume. Don't do that. So I'm walking around Pride in Seattle, and there are flags and images and words and all different kinds of things that I was like, what does that word mean? So I started like, I'm a dork. We've already clarified this. Of course, I have a little pen and paper in my bag because one, always travel with a fanny pack, and two, you never know when you need pen and paper. So I pull and I start writing out all these little notes. So finally, a person noticed that I was writing down something, and they said, oh, do you know what this word means? And I was like, no, actually, I don't. Notice, not defensive, because I don't feel entitled to know everything. And I'm stupefied that I'm sitting at a Pride and I don't know what it is. And they're draped in a flag I've never seen. So then they said, can I tell you about it? To which I said, one, I would super appreciate it. And two, this is Pride. I don't want to like interrupt you and your friends' plans to like educate me. I have Google. I took notes. I can figure this out. And they were like, no, it'd be really exciting. I'm really proud of this. Fantastic. Now we're back at Pride. Hit me. So they told me the entire history of this thing. I was so bamboozled. I don't even remember the word. I vaguely remember the flag. Plus I'm old and that was almost 2 years ago now. But whatever. So it is important to know that words are constantly being created that you do or do not know. That is what Google is for. Two, if you stumble into a word or an image that you don't know, ask permission before you make them educate you. A lot of times what happens is even in this list of sexual identity, some of these words you're very familiar with. Some of these words you're like, what was that middle thing? I don't know that word, right? So imagine the invisibility of the pride of your identity doesn't even come with people automatically knowing what that word means, or more importantly, how you as an individual use that word. So having to walk around with like a pamphlet all the time to explain it, you can either be proud of that or you can be burdened by it. And chances are those two feelings could actually happen in the same day, depending on how many pamphlets you've had to hand out. So just be mindful of that. I bring that to you because I think it's an important thing to understand that if you can break apart sex, gender, and sexual identity, and yet we have all of them. Every single one of us has all of them, but most of us haven't been reflective of our own unless we've had to come out against assumptions that were given to us. But if you didn't have to come out against assumptions that were given to you, go ahead, do it for free right now. It's a way less painful process than having to come up against assumptions that were given to you. So I encourage you to do that. But first, let's do the quick roundabout. So how I like to think about this is sex is what is in your pants, right? We tend to only really obsess about genitalia. Sex is what's in your pants. Gender is the pants. Like, are they cute little booty shorts or are they corduroy pants? How are they walking down the street? Who are they friends with? What job do they have? How high is their voice? Well, tell me more about these pants. Like, what side of the gap did they come from? Are they accessorized? What kind of shoes are they? Would I wear these pants? Like, that's gender, because you're taking a pair of pants and writing a whole story about the little elements that are there or are not there. Sexual orientation is what I assume you do when your pants are off. That is it. There is nothing else here. This is super easy. I do not know why I have to do this training so often, but I do. So, what's in your pants? The pants themselves. What do you do when your pants are off? We could log off now, except now I like to get complicated. So, if that is the education, what are you supposed to do about it? How are you supposed to advocate or do something, right? So, advocacy comes in noticing where the power is. So, if the first system of oppression between sex and gender, I'll give you a hint, it ends in ism. Anybody have a guess what it could be? You're not participating, so I will give you the answer. It is sexism. So in a sexist society, let's pick, how about the United States? Which sex has the most power? Ding, 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 ding. Mostly men. But notice that's a gendered word. So we don't say males have the most power in a sexist society. We say men because we constantly conflate sex and gender. And more importantly, it's not just men. It's people perceived as men, which could be trans men if they go stealth or something like that. But what is fascinating to me is that the most power in our sexist society is cisgender male men. And I do not mean postal carriers, right? But if you have all that stuff, you have gotten magical poker points, which is often why you get blamed for everything. You didn't necessarily make any of that stuff up. You were literally born that way. Lady Gaga has a song about that. So if you were born this way and you magically kind of win in the sexism world, that's important. However, cisgender, biological women, female people, what I think is important about us is that we also won because of the binary system. So I spend a lot of time in my 20s being very angry at straight men because I wasn't taking any responsibility for how I also am benefiting in this binary sexist world, because at least I wasn't trans or gender nonconforming. At least I was successfully perceived to be a female and a woman most of the time, right? So there's some responsibility there too. Now, if we keep going, the other oppressive force is heterosexism. So if we combine sex and gender together and then we have sexual identity at the bottom, this oppressive force is heterosexism, which basically is the assumption everybody's heterosexual, and in a heterosexual relationship, the cis male man is of course attracted to the cis female woman. This person is masculine, this person is feminine, end of picket fence story. This is great. Except people have very complicated lives, and that's not really how that works. So in a heterosexist society, let's take the United States, right? Heterosexual couples already coupled together have a lot of power. But what's incredible, and you may remember this from last workshop, is single heterosexual people have a lot of power in the United States. Think of the movie industry, right? Pick a straight single person. Whew, too many to pick, right? But if we were to pick a single gay person or a single lesbian or a gay couple or a gay or lesbian couple, we could probably do that. But we very much need them to be in a couple. And then in that couple, we will then apply, this is the masculine person, this is the feminine person. So the irony there, the irony to me that Ellen DeGeneres is the cover girl model. There's something so beautifully funny about that because she does not really wear makeup. Wouldn't Portia actually make a better cover girl model? Except capitalism, who's more famous? There we go. Now you have a butch lesbian as a makeup representative, right? Queen Latifah was for a while, but probably during only Black History Month, because that's how we roll. So if sexism and heterosexism are happening at the same time, it's at this intersection. So if you happen to be cisgender and straight, there is a lot of privilege happening when we start talking about sex, gender, and sexual identity that you just were bestowed. Congratulations. Now, a trans person, if they identify as stealth and not telling you that they're trans, or they successfully pass, meaning they're perceived inside of this binary system, they could also be in a heterosexual relationship and do also benefit for some of this privilege as long as they're not found out. Until they're found out, then that becomes a problem. So just recently, let's take this last week in general news and why I can only watch the news 3 times a week is just this week, all trans people lost all the ability to access healthcare. 2 days later, they can't be fired, right? So what is fascinating is we are talking about real human beings that are being played around as like political dog whistles. And then our response to that is also kind of this virtue signaling of like being a good person versus being a bad person when we're actually talking about real people, real families who have real jobs and maybe also have real health care needs. It's a really important thing to understand. So if we get from kind of advocacy to inclusion, what I would recommend is that we think about how we think about family and identity. And when we work with other people, how do other people identify their family and identity and then mirror their language, even if it's different than your own. Looking at your documentation or membership forms or things like this, you can't get a flu shot without getting a speech from me because the clipboard piece of paper at Walgreens will almost always say gender and then M or F, right? You're not asking for gender, you're asking for sex, and why is that relevant when I get a flu shot? So don't be my pharmacist. That's all I'd recommend. But looking at the forms that you're filling out, why are you asking the questions? And are you conflating things together in a question you may not actually even need to be asking? For federal grants and things like that, you often still need to know how many females and how many males are using a particular service, but then you would need to be asking for sex. If you are looking for men's groups or women's groups or something like that, then you would need to be asking for gender. But ask yourself first, why are you asking in the first place? And what is on your documentation? Looking at your vendors and your suppliers, how diverse are those vendors and suppliers across gender, across relationships? Most people don't think about it. You just call Tony because she's a really quick call and you know that she can fix it, right? Like that's just what you end up doing. So there's a good review to kind of think about. Looking at your signage or your marketing materials, what relationships are showing up. Commercials are a really fascinating tip for this in that I think it is incredible when like a black family uses paper towels. Not because it's June, but because they're a black family that are using paper towels and even step on a Lego, right? Like, whoa, every parent has done that. I'm not even a parent and I have done that. So there's something about inclusion that takes the like, hey, look what we did here, to like, these people are using paper towels and we want people to use our paper towels. Thinking of your marketing, thinking of your signage, what means family, who's using your services, who's available to use your services. Yesterday I did something specifically with meeting planners. When we start talking about facilities and accommodations, you can ask people what they need and then tell them, okay, good to know. We can't do all of that, but this is what we can do. Oh, okay, good. Thanks for asking. Thanks for following up. And thanks for letting me know what I'll have to take care of myself. There is also the possibility that you already have accommodations, but you don't tell anyone about them because you know it's private. If you don't tell anyone about it, no one knows about it. So tell people about it, right? Like that's an important thing. Oh, I just did facilities and accommodations. Protocols and guidelines. These are really important. They're often written down. Sometimes they're just how you function as an organization. So in a staff meeting, who's taking notes? I always find it very funny that like on every board I've ever been on, which funny enough does not happen very often because I'm such a jerk. But when people are like, Jess, will you take the notes? And I'll be like, I don't have a penis. And they're like, what? I'm the only woman in the room. Why do I have to take the notes? Have you seen my handwriting? Bad move, right? So I say that kind of stuff all the time. So I am self-employed and get away with that kind of stuff. You might have to be a little bit more delicate. But like, what are the norms? Who does what? Who's in charge of bringing the food, right? How does gender show up there? When this accidentally just happened last night, my husband was making the salad and I was finishing dinner. He finished the salad and I had like the bowls out to put everything in. He finished the salad and he just went and sat down in the dining room. And I was like, oh, excuse me, let me bring you your meal. And instead, I didn't realize this, but the dog had stepped on his foot in a weird way, so he was actually like taking his shoe off. But like instantly, I was all like, "Yes, sir, here's your dinner." And he was like, "Whoa, what's going on? There's something going on with the dog." But that was me immediately falling into gender roles, right? Like, let me bring you your salad. But that wasn't what was happening. But if people are feeling that way, that is what's happening to at least one of these parties, right? So I'm in charge of checking that. I didn't know how strong that was. There it was. And I think it's important to notice. So, more questions and comments? I'm checking. I have a text. Oh, someone's letting me know. Got it. John's already back in. Good to know. Nope. Okay, we're going to plow forward. Now let's get to empowerment, right? So what's fun about empowerment is people are like, what exactly does that mean? And to what level does someone need to be empowered? I actually hate this word, but people are very excited by it. So I put it in the slide. But the reason why is very few people that you think you can empower actually need you to empower them. They got plenty of power. You just need to shut up enough to listen to them. So let's talk about children, for example. Well, let's do some children empowerment. You know what children's empowerment is? Shut up. Stop being a grown-up and listen to the children. The children are very smart. They know what's going on. They have plenty of power, but they don't have space to amplify their own voices. So ultimately, when we're talking about empowerment, that's what I mean, is get out of people's way and listen. But that does not make a good slide. So I have a couple of handouts that I will email along with the video of this that are kind of good exercises for you to just think and notice, like, oh, wow, that's where my bias shows up. Oh, wow, this is where this is happening. Because when we start talking about being an ally to trans or intersex people, we often just go to what we know that helps out gay and lesbian people. Very different, maybe, because trans and intersex people could identify as gay, lesbian, bisexual, or something else. They could also identify as heterosexual. So when you really start talking about being an ally, how can you be an ally to them that isn't about their sexual orientation, right? So then when we start talking about how the needs of trans people may differ from the needs of non-trans or cisgender LGB people, now we're keeping it in the LGB community, but how might their needs be different, right? It's a really important thing to understand. Trans people are tokenized all of the time. Trans people of color are tokenized even more and are significantly more likely to be unemployed, underemployed, experience housing loss, have food instability, and experience significant community violence at the police hands, as well as at the hands of gay, lesbian, bisexual partners, people in the community, etc. So then now we want them to also be on our pamphlet, like being mindful of that, right? I think that's an important thing. Recently, when the defund police movement kind of was building power in Minneapolis, the local Minneapolis City Council was one of the first to really vote for some pretty significant defunding measures. There's 2 Black trans members on the Minneapolis City Council, and for their stories and their experiences and the pieces of the community that they're representing, the conversation was able to be in a different place. Not everybody has the privilege, I'm using that word on purpose, of having the actual empowered trans women of color voices, trans people, Black people of color voices present when we're making policy. But when we do, it's very hard not to listen to them, right? So then that's what empowerment means, is getting people's voices with different experiences and different stories into the conversations. Notice I didn't say at the table, because at the table means that somebody, not them, owns that table, owns the room, and left the door open and had some little snackies for some different people. It's a very different power dynamic, although I do like snacks. So let me give you my texting number again, just in case, 202-670-4262. You are welcome to text, but that is a very quick overview of a triangle. So I could give everyone vertigo and back up to the full triangle, but I'm going to stop share, find that slide, and pull it back up again. But what I would like to do is open this up into an actual conversation about how this is kind of playing out for you, what you knew you didn't know, what you didn't know you didn't know, so we can kind of see where we're going, so that that actually helps me figure out what we're going to do for part 3. So you should be able to unmute yourself, I believe. Is that a true story? Great. So, thoughts, comments, how are you doing?
I'll say something. Yeah, I think I will. I think this is part of, I think what goes on for me is I find that I stumble and fumble and I want to self audit and edit. And I read something last night about failing forward. Kind of like, I think you pulled something out, and that this is how I learned is I said really something kind of foolish. And then somebody called me in, and I totally know from my standpoint, I have so much to just really internalize and get around gender and identity and sex, quite honestly, and where I mix all of these things up. So I feel like this is very new language for me, and so it's just it's hard, yeah, until you
Well,
start practicing, yeah.
yeah, so first off, this is a great time to ask questions. I don't work in this group. You have to see all your colleagues before, so that could be nervousy making. But that's why I have the texting number 2, is that you can text message me anything you want to with no editing. You are not going to offend me because I have done this training a lot, right? But then number 1, I can answer your question, and I can also teach you how to ask that question in a way that makes more sense. And it is really complicated, right? Like, everything is based on an assumption of gender, and we can't talk about sex because it's not socially acceptable, right? So, like, I like to use this example quite often. So I am a cisgender woman. I identify as a lesbian. Okay, clear. That usually is kind of like, okay, I think I know those words. Okay, I think we're good, right? So I met my husband, totally fell in love with him the day I met him, broke up with my girlfriend, waited 3 weeks for him to call me. I eventually called him. So we were not married at the time, right? Because I had just met him, and I'm a weird stalker person, but I won, just saying. So I met my husband. So my husband came in. He was a PhD student at the school that I was running the LGBT center for. So technically a student, but he was done with classes. So he scheduled a meeting with me to make sure that when he started his transition process, that like the name on his diplomas and stuff like that would be correct. So he schedules an appointment with me, comes into my office, and tells me that he is transitioning. I, the expert, hand him all different kinds of trans women, pink paper, binary kind of things, swivel around in my chair to my computer. I distinctly remember thinking, like, this is going to be very hard. I am not sure how you are ever going to pass as a woman, but good luck. Turn around, give him all these pink things, and he's literally like, I'm a woman. And I was like, oh shit, this is going to be way easier for you, right? That is how I met my husband. So if I'm the expert and I'm screwing this up all the time, I am not done screwing up. I am available to continually screw up. Now, what is fascinating is if we were to play the little triangle game with my husband. So when he graduated with his PhD, he's one of those weird types. I think it's a Capricorn thing, but he's friends with all of his exes. I do not know this life. So at his PhD little party, all of his exes show up. So you might be surprised by this, but what showed up were about 5 different women, all of which were large women. We are all wearing polka dots. We are all loud and taking over. We have charmed the entire pizza hall. We're using the intercom. We've taken over the DJ space. We have networked with every single person who's there. We have tabletop activities going on because we all have huge, big, giant personalities who actually decided not to go for each other, and we have decided to be friends. That's also new for me. Okay, so in my husband's life, right? He was born a cisgender woman. At some point in time in his life, he realized that he was attracted to women. That was called a lesbian. Oh, okay, great. So now he's a lesbian. So literally he walked into the wrong room and then is so Irish Catholic he didn't know how to leave the wrong room because he was supposed to be in a meeting and instead he was in a presentation with Jameson Green. Jameson Green is a famous trans man who was doing a presentation on transition and trans men. He was supposed to be in a budget committee. Can you blame him for staying in the wrong room? So he's watching Jameson Green and he's like, this is an option? Had no idea this was an option, right? So as a lesbian, seemed to be attracted to women who were very large, also identified as lesbians who have very big personalities. So began his transition process. So as he began his transition process, there's different medical interventions that he had access to or that he could afford at the time or whatever. He met me. So that sped things up because I knew how to do all the paperwork. My job is hassle factor. So it turns out that he identifies as a man. Okay, great. He's a man, surprise, attracted to large women with really big personalities, but that's now called heterosexual. So this is why I don't use sexual orientation. His orientation has not changed at all, but his identity has. Now, what's interesting is that I have been attracted to masculine, super smart people, like the person at a party reading Kafka in the bath, like in the kitchen. That is the person I'm always attracted to. They're usually wearing Puma sneakers as well. So the people that I have been attracted to have not evolved and changed over time either. So my orientation or my taste has not evolved, but what it's been called has changed over time, just like him, except my gender has stayed the same and my anatomical and sex parts have stayed the same. Unless you now start talking about I had a hysterectomy, so I don't have any of those parts anymore. My innards have shifted, and I am now on hormone replacement therapy just like he is. We have something in common, right? So, Vivi, to your point, the shit is complicated, and thinking like, oh, I know, and you can just tie it in a little bow, that's actually the problem. So when you undo the bow, can happen, but then like this fully lived, complicated, fully expressed, empowered person can exist. So I appreciate you saying like, right? But I think it's an important thing to understand. So it's complicated. So
Thank you.
excellent, sure. So there's a comment. We want more voices in the conversation as we move forward. Any tips on how we reach out and build new relationships while avoiding tokenism? Not sure if I'm wording the question right. So first off, it's perfectly worded. So what is weird is you're wanting them is step one, right? Congratulations, you want something. You then somehow on some subconscious level have a timeline of when you will achieve what you want. That's the problem, right? So you're not entitled to getting what you want. So you can want something, and by wanting something, that is the foundation of creating a space and an environment where the culture speaks for itself as far as who is welcome and who is allowed to come there. Now, that is also a way of like, well, I guess we'll just keep the door open, right? But you can actively be doing things with that door open that allow an organization to showcase what it truly is or truly isn't. Now, I think it's really funny to me, and I don't know why I'm entertained by this, but most of the organizations I work with that are trying really, really hard to diversify and be better allies and work better and do better and be better are light years ahead of the douche canoe organizations that do not do these webinars, right? So you're already ahead, but you're so far ahead that you don't have a lot of role models of what to do to stay ahead. All you want to make sure you're doing is not falling behind, which is why that boils up, because you're like, I can't fall behind, I can't fall behind, can't fall behind. But you don't, getting one is not a feather in your hat that you have not fallen behind. That's tokenization. So when one person comes and you're like, look, didn't fall behind, right? Like that is your own stuff. That's not about creating a space that's welcome to more people. So go back to, where do you post your events? Where do you post your job descriptions? How does your search committee work? What kind of things do you do? What kind of things do you not do? Literally what you have to do is figure out, what do you not know that you are not doing? And once you find out something that you didn't know you weren't doing, then you get to pick and choose whether or not you are going to do that. The current things that you are doing will not result in significantly different results because they are the current things that you are doing. So now what you have to do is reward failure. Said no capitalist ever. But if people have ideas, Give it a whirl, right? Nope, that didn't work. Okay, because you did it once, or because there was a time frame, or because it got too expensive. What do you mean it didn't work? What means work, right? That's how you start creating whole new systems and whole new things. Tokenization is flipping through the phone book, some of you recall what that is, and looking for like the similar organization that has the symbol that means something different than, oh, we'll just ask them to show up. We'll put their pamphlets in the lobby, right? Or like a subscription to Ebony magazine does not make you racially diverse. It does, however, put a magazine in the lobby that may or may not be useful to other people who are in the lobby. Another piece that I think is significantly important is asking questions that you do not know the answers to. We tend to only ask questions that we are fairly confident we know what answer we're going to get back. That's actually not really the purpose of asking a question. What that is providing an opportunity for someone else to show you how smart you are. So what questions could you ask? If you're interested in more voices in a conversation, what would happen if that conversation does not follow any of the current conversation protocols? What happens then, right? So I remember the first time I had a speaking gig in Puerto Rico, I was supposed to do an interactive icebreaker as part of what I was supposed to do. So there were about 600 women in about half a ballroom. There's 2 cars, there's this huge stage, and the tables were super close together. Like I think there were 12 people in the rounds, very, very close together. And if I could stereotype the 600 women that were there, all of them had on platform high heels and giant purses, all of them. So there's stuff on the floor, they got heels, they got chairs, everything's too close together. And I was like, there is no way that I can do an interactive icebreaker here, because how are people going to move around? Well, that was me and my like whiteness showing up. Also complete unfamiliarity with platform heels and giant purses, right? So I assumed people would need to be near their stuff. And the idea of heels and chairs that close together, I was like, can't move. You're basically frozen, because that is how I would feel in the heels. So very quickly, I came up with something that just interacted with the people at their tables instead of interacting with other people in the room. The person after me had everybody standing up and doing salsa moves in between all the tables, of which they handled just fine. I cannot imagine a room full of white people that close together doing anything interactive, because we would be like, this is my water glass, right? But I didn't know what I didn't know, because I haven't been in a room full of people who live in Puerto Rico who are used to space in a very different way than I am. You don't know what you don't know. Can you do something wildly different? Sure. What would that be? How about this one thing I'm very comfortable with? More likely to be tokenization. You're probably going to be uncomfortable with things that are wildly different. Hey, I'm checking text. I have one more text. Recently, J.K. Rowling talked about people who menstruate and it caused some trouble. Can you comment on that? Okay, so here's what's fun about J.K. Rowling. First off, full disclosure, I'm experiencing a global pandemic over here. And so I enrolled in an MBA program. I should talk to my boss. P.S. I'm self-employed. So I am taking school for the first time since 1996, which means I have not been watching the news. But something happened so big that even in my, like, I took Facebook off my phone. People were like, Jess, J.K. Rowling, J.K. So I know something happened. I do not know what actually happened, but what is amazing is that TERFs happen. What's a TERF? So trans exclusionary radical feminists, TERFs. So radical feminists, usually white women, do not believe trans people are real. And they believe that trans people are like wolves in sheep's clothing taking over women's spaces. Personally, I find that highly problematic, if not utterly disgusting. So J.K. Rowling evidently has a long history of making transphobic comments, TERF-related comments, etc. And not knowing anything but reading this text, evidently it had something to do with people who menstruate. So now what's interesting is whatever she was talking about, people who menstruate, we are now on the sex side of the triangle. right? So even if you were to read the Supreme Court decision that came out that we can no longer discriminate against gay or trans people and fire them from work, did I read that? No, that's why I married a pocket smart person. So he read the whole thing. We talked about it at dinner. I paid attention to maybe 10% of it. But what the argument is basically that Title VII says you can't discriminate based on sex. And if you would treat a straight couple differently than you would treat a gay couple or a lesbian couple, then that is discrimination based on sex because you're treating the men differently than the women if they have the same sex or different sex partner. That is basically what Gorsuch was. Can you believe Gorsuch wrote the opinion? Anyway, okay, so reading Alito's dissent, which is like 3,000 pages long because I think he's a little upset. And again, I didn't read it. I'm talking about this over dinner. So when you're reading that, basically what it is like, this gonna open the door to all kinds of problems. And all of those problems are trans related. Trans people are going to be in bathrooms. They're going to be playing on sports teams. They're going to be moving in next door to you. They already are. So good news. J.K. Rowling's piece of like pulling from gender down to biological sex, and the fear tactics are the conflation of sex and gender to begin with. Right? When we start talking about who's using a bathroom, we're not talking about urinating and pooping. We're talking about wolves in sheep clothing, seeking violence or causing violence, which ultimately is internalized sexism, right? Is that I actually have met men who can do other things than actually be predators. They make sandwiches, they play with children, they have jobs, they drive cars, they take naps. Men are really amazing creatures, right? But at the root of that is that all men are sexual predators and have to be controlled. So then we're only talking about trans women. So then trans men experience even more violence. So when TERFs come in, mostly it is trans women are not real women, and trans men will detransition back to women because that's where they belong in the first place. So it's just very invalidating of the reality of who trans people are. The fact that it's been coming out of a very popular author is not a new thing. The fact that it's coming out of J.K. Rowling is also not a new thing, but evidently it was on Twitter. Okay, we're 7 minutes over. Thoughts, comments? There is a motion, just for the record, instead of picking Harry Potter houses, that we now all decide which Golden Girl we are.
Love that.
I'm totally Sophia and a Slytherin. Okay.
I'll follow up with a quick question if that's okay, and if anyone needs to leave, like, no need to listen in. But I remember you were saying the roles, identity, and expression were sort of outbound messages for like telling a story about how you want to be perceived.
Mm-hmm.
And so what I really struggle with a lot is like that itself, like the pants, I guess, in terms of like, you know, if you see somebody wearing something, are they trying to tell you a story about how you're supposed to perceive them? Or are you writing a story on top of what they're wearing of how you assume they want to be perceived? So that's kind of where I feel like I get caught a lot, is that I'd rather not make any assumptions. And so for me, the safety zone is like, you know, they're wearing a pink dress doesn't mean anything. But it has come to my attention that maybe that's not the way to do it. And I know you would probably say something, again, assumptions, like, why don't you just ask them? But like, I don't really want to like.
You can't always ask though. And like,
yeah. I don't want to treat people differently based on how they look, but then sometimes how people present themselves or is signaling how they want to be treated. So
let me do like a couple of breakdowns. So first off, I do not think that it is a good practice to try to never make a judgment and an assumption. So I did not misspeak there. So we make judgments and assumptions to feel safe and prepared. It doesn't mean that we're right, but we do it so that we feel safe and prepared. Our life has taught us that if we do this, this, and this, we will feel safe and prepared. It takes humility to be like, oh, look, I'm doing that thing again. Well, let's find out who this person actually is, right? But I don't think that it's effective that I'm just a blank slate. No, you're not. You're alive, right? So, like the example I like to use back in the day when I would walk in airports is someone's walking behind me based on the sound of the person who's coming behind me would directly impact what I would do. Now, I am a jerk, right? So if I hear what I think are heels, why are you traveling in those shoes to begin with? Right? Ugh, judging women, it's an Olympic skill I have. Usually it is a very loud man on a cell phone, like, well, Michael, this is the final deal, right? Like, why do you need to be selling at the top of your lungs in between gates? So I break so that they hit me because I find that hysterical. Sometimes, if I think it is a woman with a kid, I get very excited because they might have those rolly shoes or the light up shoes. And so I will move to the side, right? That is my own, I am responsible for those three very different things based on a sound. So, what you're talking about is that you see something and you're like, oh, I can't write a story. Why is that person wearing a dress? You're writing a story doing this. So, at step one, wow, I am writing a story because that person is wearing a dress, right? So, when I was a little kid and my mother took me to see Annie, the person who was sitting next to my mother looked like a man who was wearing a dress and pantyhose. And I asked my mother, I was young, I asked my mother, is that a man or a woman sitting next to you? And my mother said, I don't know, but I bet that they're an Annie fan. Okay, great. So the introduction of using they, them as pronouns. Who cares? They're here to see Annie, right? Like, that is not a very important variable that you need to know. What was important is that I didn't know, and I thought it was important that I didn't know. Not important. And it is also signaling, but it's not necessarily just signaling who they want to be, but why have we determined that only certain items of clothing can be worn by a certain type of person, right? Like, that's a system that's weird and dumb, right? So that is a really pretty dress if you like it. If I was wearing a pink dress, you would not necessarily question it, and I would be in drag. Somebody made, there is money behind this. We are fundraising something, something is happening, right? But if you don't know that about me, you would kind of assume that that was just my dress because you need to find more information. So I don't think there's anything wrong with making the assumptions. What it sounds like is clothing is one of your tips, right? That you look for clothing to be like, to categorize people. Okay, there's no judgment in that. It's just what you do. And you're probably not always right. So how do you find out what you want to do or what you don't want to do, right? Somewhat like the Jonathan guy on Queer Eyes for the Straight Guy who has like a full beard and really long hair and is wearing feminine clothing. Like, the idea that you could just be like giving so little shits because beards, long hair, and dresses are not supposed to go together. And that is exactly that person's point. That the self-expression is that I think this is a dumb system and I want to wear this today. That's ultimately it. But it doesn't answer other things like what does their entire body look like? Why do you need to know that if you're walking on a street? Well, I need to know what kind of roles do they play in their family. Really? Because I think they're just ordering a cappuccino, right? Well, I need to know exactly how they would fill out this form. Are you giving them a form? No. Well, then you don't need to know that either, right? Like, so our entitlement to know is rooted in that I'm not allowed to make assumptions and I have so many questions. I don't even know how to word the question. So I'm just going to stare. Wait, can't do that either. I'm going to take a photograph and stare at this photo down here until I can figure it out. Or it could just be a person wearing a pink dress. Like, there's no meaning there at all. All of those things could be true. If I was going to like somebody and I like, if we live in a very small town, so I went to every single doctor first and was completely obnoxious around trans education to make sure that it was a safe place before they became our primary care physician or whatever. And truth be told, the doctor that my husband has as a primary care physician, I think is a terrible doctor, has horrible HIPAA boundaries, and is awful, like town gossip. No, I am not going to her, but she is really good with trans folks. So we have different primary care physicians, even though my, like, I will go first didn't work out. Oh, I mean, it did. We found him a great doctor, and I have a different doctor who doesn't gossip about my friends in the grocery store. Small towns. So I don't know if that's helpful, but like, just notice it instead of solving it can kind of diffuse some of that pressure. So a lot of times I think we overcompensate. Like, I want to be an ally so bad. So I'll be like, Josh, those are lovely heels. Where did you get them? I want to wear those. Those are beautiful. Tell me more. And like, you wouldn't do that to normal people, right? So like, don't do that to weird people. Josh, I just picked you because you're in the bottom right corner. I'm sure you have lovely shoes. Okay, 15 minutes over. I apologize. Slash, don't apologize.
I have a
Susan?
question. Oh, sorry.
Oh, no, no, go ahead.
Similar to that one, I guess I don't know how to use words like masculinity and femininity, both in my relationship to other people and what I think is attractive or what I perceive or see in myself. And then also when I hear other people talk about those words. So I'm just wondering what your relationship is to talking about those both in the way that you see yourself and others, and like talking about like attraction to folks who are masculine when like what does that mean to that person. Yeah, I'm just wondering if you have thoughts about that.
Yeah, so great question. Still very much working on this. I have noticed in myself, I think that the degree of internalized sexism that I connected to femininity is one, I can blame this on being a woman in Texas, but I can also just blame this on not fitting in, right? Like, so my pressure to fit in as a being a girl in Texas is I was, as much as my parents I think would say they weren't doing this, I really was supposed to like find myself a husband, be seen and not heard, right? Like there's nothing about me that is going to not be seen and not heard, right? Like I've been declarative out of the womb. So that didn't fit that narrative. So then I think that narrative to me became femininity, which is not necessarily true, but I didn't know how to navigate that. I had progressive parents, so I had met gay men, but I had never met lesbians. The joke there is that I had a volleyball and a basketball coach that were roommates. Didn't even know what that meant at the time, though, right? So I hadn't met lesbians until much later in life. And it wasn't until I didn't come out until I was 27. And the people that I found myself attracted to, what ended up, there was a pattern, right? Is that I'd be like, whoa, who's that? And then whoever I was with would be like, oh, that's a woman. And I'd be like, oh, well, never mind. I didn't know that. But I have always been attracted to people that I didn't know that I didn't know what gender they were, right? But there was some degree of masculinity, but obviously some degree of being a woman that smushed together in a way that I would typically find attractive. So I didn't have the words or the language for that until many years later. I was actually hired as a communications professor. It was a hard year for them, I'm assuming. But masculine communication styles and feminine communication styles for me was like the first time I saw a chart and I was like, oh, weird. I know men who have feminine communication styles, right? So, like, my husband is a really great example. He's like charitable and kind and has an ability of no matter what gloopesty somebody is saying to him, he will take two things that he has learned from it first, lead with that, and then add some more learning to it. He's very collaborative. Like every process and every email needs to be reviewed by everyone that's being implicated by it coming from this organization that he's the president of. It's very like slow and intentional, etc. And I'm probably interpreting it from my masculine communication places, which is like a lot of bold font and some bullets and like the shit's done. What? I can always send another email and follow up if I need to. That's what I was thinking in the moment. Like, I have very masculine communication standards according to this chart, in that I am, there's not a lot of flower happening, there's not a lot of punctuation often. I certainly don't start an email with, like, hi, how are you? How are things with sheltering in place going? Learned any new banana bread recipes? Hey, if you have a minute, I have a question. Right? Like, no, I'm like, dude, I got a question. Boom. Like, that's it. Some of that is also probably Gen Xer versus Boomer. I don't know. But I don't communicate that way. So to me, that chart was very, very helpful, but it is also very binary because it's assuming that you have to do this and you have to do this, right? If I'm talking to a client, I can't be as direct as I want to be because that's not what they're paying for. And sometimes it totally is. And now we're getting into, like, is that like being a dominatrix or something as a woman versus masculine communication styles versus being a consultant, right? Like, these are all things I've had to grapple with, that I also had to realize how much internalized sexism I have been holding and grappling onto by not addressing what it means that I am really actually a woman and that femininity can be a very powerful thing. It doesn't mean weakness, right? Things like that. Like, even me talking about high heels, like, part of my, like, demystification is, one, orthotics, and two, I don't have strong enough legs or back to pull them off. And why? Vans happen. Why would you wear heels? So understanding all of those things, right, is helpful. So I don't know, Elizabeth, if there is like a way of doing masculinity or doing femininity or talking about them, but isn't it fascinating though how much of our world makes it assume and makes and assumes that that is clean and organized and equal and even, right? Like, where did that come from? Like, why is that, right? Like, I mean, even if we were to take something as what's old school controversial compared to what's happening these days, but like when we take Colin Kaepernick kneeling on one knee, right? It is nonviolent civil disobedience. It is an effective way of drawing attention and taking advantage of a platform that one person is on. And it never felt like loud or aggressive enough to me. And its effectiveness stirred up a conversation that centered patriotism and freedom of speech in a different place for the people in power to still be having a conversation that they're more comfortable with on the same subject. That dismantled an entire conversation in silence from one motion, right? Like, I learned so much from that in comparison, right? So then, if even if we take the current protests that are happening now, like, peaceful presence in mass is actually rooted in feminine communication and is far more effective. So then, when boredom and hate show up in the background and actually start causing damage and things like this, like, that's what we call a protest. Because I think masculine communication gets the media attention, but it's feminine communication in this case that was actually and is still keeping a conversation front and center, right? How do we do that person to person? I don't know that I'm an expert at it, but I do think that it's my responsibility to use the tools to, like, map out and monitor what is happening. Um, Me being attracted to masculinity didn't have to do with strength in, like, muscles and brute force. Like, I bring the Neanderthal into the relationship, but is the combination of a masculine energy. I don't even know what that means, but a masculine energy person who actually is strong enough to be quiet and a listener and paying attention to what's actually happened. It doesn't have to be a firework all the time to exist or persist. That is what I was attracted to. And they happen to be brunette, usually in a hoodie, reading a book at a party, right? Like, so I can't imagine that being remotely helpful. And don't worry, I have a shrink. But to answer your question, that whole word cloud is needed to be able to figure out where you fit and where you don't fit. And I don't know the answer for anybody else because I don't even know the answer for me.
Cool. Feels right for me too.
Great. Other thoughts or
Susan,
comments? This is great.
I think Susan had a question.
Oh,
Yeah,
go.
I did. And so Jess, we actually also had you down to 1:30.
I know. I just saw that. So now I don't even
Okay.
have to worry anymore.
Okay, good.
Ding.
I so what I heard you say earlier is that using the term sexual orientation is not, you shouldn't do that, and that sexual identity was a better word. And I'd like to just hear a little bit more about that.
Sure. So I would take the should out of the statement. So use
Uh-huh.
whatever language the person you're talking to is using. That's the
Okay.
most important thing. Whatever word you're more comfortable with is also fun for you to know. But whatever word someone else is more comfortable with, you should always use their language when talking with them. I used to do, we did a traveling roadshow program with the American College Personnel Association for the like 25th anniversary of sexual orientation being included in the non-discrimination policy for the association, and then it becoming kind of a precedent for colleges and universities around the country. And my co-facilitator, Jamie Washington, is about 10, 15 years, he would probably say 10 years older than me. Um, and when we would get to that part of the triangle, he would always like fluffle in the back of the room. And so after doing a couple of them, I was like, just out of curiosity, like, what is it about sexual orientation, sexual identity that I can see you like, what is happening there? And he said, so I'm 46, so he's probably in his early 60s, but he probably would say he's in his mid 50s. So he would say that, you know, in my Black community, in my seminary community, as a reverend, as a gay man, in my fraternity, etc., as a HIV positive person, we fought so hard to move from lifestyle or sexual preference to get to orientation. It feels disrespectful of that time and energy for you to dismiss sexual orientation and now say sexual identity. So I stand back here looking at someone who's like newer and younger and also an activist and also putting in work and energy, like taking away the term I fought for and turning it into a different term. And it just feels so. Of course, this is playing out openly in the middle of a training, but it's a really great example of like white versus Black, age as well, right? So like he was doing most of his activism in the 80s while I was like wearing a 24-hour headgear. So I really kind of came into my activism voice like late 90s, early 2000s. And by that point, he was like mentoring kind of the next generation. So where these words kind of happen and matter, there's a connection to the work that it took to make those words real. And some people still use lifestyle and preference to even describe themselves. I have not really experienced people using lifestyle and preference on a regular basis. If anything, it comes out in, to like Vivi, to use you as an example, when you started your question, you were like, I don't even know how to say it. I don't know what words to use. I'm going to stumble, but I'm going to try because that's important. So here goes. Sentence I hope doesn't offend someone, right? So like the preamble of like, I'm not exactly sure, is usually where like lifestyle or preference in my world or my experience will show up. So it's so prefaced with, I know that I'm probably not saying this right. I don't even take those words seriously anymore because like it isn't a lifestyle. It obviously isn't a preference. Although back to Elizabeth's point around gender, there could be some preference situations. That's a different workshop, right? So sexual orientation was, to me, my joke is that I'm not a compass. I don't like land in a town and like beep, 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 beep to the lesbian bar. And that's what orientation felt like to me. And so then using the example of my husband's like attraction has not changed. My attraction has not changed, but some of the other variables have. So then the identity or the label used to describe that attraction has changed. So to me, sexual identity fits better to a wider variety of couples or descriptors that people might use in relationship. We also were at a conference, a partners conference, where we heard the term heteroqueer, and we were like, tell me more about this word. So again, who gets the right to develop new words? But the idea of heteroqueer is that we're still deeply rooted in the queer community, but benefit from heterosexual privilege because we're perceived as a like old fuddy-duddy couple, right? Like I'm a professor's wife at home. Blah. So those kind of wording and language also has to do with the context that you're in. So I don't know if that's helpful. So
Yeah, it is. Thank you so much. Yeah.
sure. Now we're at the top of the half hour. Any other? Let me check my texts. I'm glad we got J.K. Rowling in there. And I got to show off that I was actually listening at dinner last night talking about the Supreme Court case. That was actually on a dog walk and dinner. So I asked some follow-up questions. Okay, I don't have any texts. Any other thoughts, comments?
I might want to talk about this later as well, but like, I guess what I sort of meant by the clothing question is sort of like, I don't know if it's like internalized sexism or what, but at some point the idea got in my head that the solution, right, is like destroy everything in terms of like, we don't do this thing where we have the category and like we don't have the assumptions, like of course acknowledging that like we always have things going around in our head, but to create a new cultural norm where those things don't have meaning, like sort of in the sense of like you might have some idea of like a short person's personality when you see them because they're short and you're like short, cute, must be like blah 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 thing, you know, but it doesn't have these wide systemic implications, and you don't have this like gut reaction when a short person turns out to not have whatever your idea of what they're supposed to be. You're like, oh, I was wrong. And it doesn't cause this like deep sense of like, oh no, like panic that I guess a lot of people have when they see gender being violated in a way that, and I use violated like sarcastically, you know, like when people just freak out. And like, to me, the way to stop that is to stop like everything. And I don't like how that sounds like in terms, it sounds like a colorblind solution, which, you know, it's not.
So there's a lot in there. So the two things that I think I hear the most, or I think the most and feel the most around this kind of thing is, you know, Control Alt Delete start over. That would be fantastic. What are we going to do in the meantime? Right? So that's the first question. So like, whoops, screwed up, let's start over. What are we going to do in the meantime? If we could do that around all systems of oppression, that would be amazing. But it will be very challenging for folks to format a hard drive while also still using the computer. So sure, that'd be amazing, but what are we going to do in the meantime? The other thing that I would say is when we default, like if we're talking about the patriarchy, right, just as an example, when we take away gender and we move to androgyny, what almost always happens is we all look like men, right? Like we all default to like neutrals and pants. And so then like, what's wrong with a good pattern, right? Like I like a good circle skirt, right? Like they're fun. Why get rid of it? And why are we getting rid of these things instead of these things? We just default to these things. Well, now we're just affirming a patriarchal system and calling it genderless. Well, that I don't want to. I am quite fond of my polka dots. Thank you very much. Right? So Control Alt Delete doesn't also take into consideration like the aesthetic of beauty, of differentiation, of like what different patterns and what different fabrics are even capable of doing, and how that in itself is part of self-expression, right? Like I think that I can say these couple of things, and my guess is that y'all will all immediately, like, regardless of your sex or gender or sexual orientation or identity, you will all go to some place, right? But like your favorite cozy socks. Why do we have a pair of favorite cozy socks, right? Like, why? I don't know, but I know which ones they are. But if mine are purple, then does that mean I have to give that up because purple is a very gendered color? You're not taking my fuzzy socks, right? But if I were to take the outfit that I feel the most strong in, right? Like the most absolutely confident and strong, and take that outfit, like regardless of what that is, would I have to take that away because that is also gendered? Because feeling strong about yourself and confident about yourself is also gendered, right? Like, so we have to be careful that we're not debunking the wrong system as an ally to the other system. So, and in
So
the
absolutely, I
meantime,
totally agree with that. I just like where I'm tripping up is kind of what Elizabeth was saying with masculine and feminine is that that's the bond that for me like sets off whatever trigger I guess you would call it is like the idea that you know these things have these ties and that is tied in with this whole other system and like yeah that's just what I struggle with because I have heard that those ties have a lot of meaning for a lot of people
mhm,
and so that's where I struggle in terms of me seeing somebody like say there's like a little 4-year old and that's whole child psychology whatever but pink ballerina whatever femininity and the tie between the femininity and the pink is important to that person while at the same time being connected to like this larger system and the pink this isn't really a good example but something like being quiet or different things that are treated a certain way in the system that we have like it's it's just like very difficult to yeah I'm kind of running out of words and I don't want to like drag this out again
no, I think
so
the
we
piece
can
that you're
I can
missing,
totally google and stuff like that but
what's important, I think, though, is if we take the pink Tinkerbell, right, is that this culture has connected Pink and Tinkerbell together, but that person also could connect, I haven't been able to do this and now I can, right? So it's this extreme. So I'm reminded of a really good friend of mine as she was beginning her transition process. She drove down to San Francisco and had like a girls' weekend, and it was her first like 24/7 dressing as a woman, being as a woman in San Francisco, and it was very important to her. And as she was driving back, she had gotten her nails done and her makeup done, and she didn't have a wig at the time, so she actually had grown her hair out long, so it was her natural hair. And she'd gotten her nails done, and as she was driving back up to Eureka, so it's like a 6-hour drive. So as she was driving back up, she got a flat tire and had to call AAA. So she's sitting in her car in like kind of what she refers to as her like boy clothes. She called AAA, and all of a sudden she realized she still had her nails on. So in the time between the call and the tow truck coming, she plicked all of her nails off because she knew that they would be interpreted a certain way, right? So like that gets to that kind of gendered system, and she really like feared for what could happen because she was already in a vulnerable place needing a tire change, and now in a different vulnerable place as a white upper class man driving a BMW who was also wearing ceramic nails, and it was just too much for them to take, right? The tow truck driver shows up and it's this beautiful woman with fake nails. Like, would that have still been a problem? Maybe. Would it have been less of a problem? Maybe, right? Like, we can't know, right? So the even the pink and the blue, like blue used to be the feminine color because of the Virgin Mary and Christian dominance, and at the time Catholic dominance, right? And it switched because we went to World War I and blue represented military uniforms and women couldn't serve in the military. So all of this is kind of made up. And so Carrie, I think what I would take is it can have meaning for them and it can have meaning for you, and neither of those things are wrong. It can also have no meaning for you and it can have no meaning for them, and none of those things are wrong. But if it has meaning for one and no meaning for the other person, then it feels like we're in conflict. When in reality, we just could have a conversation. So the in the meantime, before control alt deleting all oppressive systems, is just allowing people to like live their life. And that sounds so easy to do, but we want to feel prepared and safe while letting people live their life. So then we need to know all this information before we take the first step. That's the piece that I think we actually can do something about. But I mean, I think your questions are really profoundly relevant right now when we're talking about like the police system and the prison system and the education system and who is disenfranchised voting wise in our country, and we're heading into an election, and who has access to healthcare and who's dying from COVID versus sick for a very long time versus doesn't even think this is real and is floating on some raft in a river right now. Like the known perceptions can have meaning or no meaning for you, and meaning and no meaning for the other person. But that doesn't mean you're in the same place. And I'm using the word meaning a lot, but it's the meaning of people being in a different place than you without you really knowing where you're at or really checking in at where they're at, that I think that we have created this very polarized way of interacting with each other. And that I think can get debunked in the meantime.
That's very helpful. Thank you.
No
I
worries.
actually appreciated using the word meaning. That actually was very helpful. Thank you.
No worries. I married a philosopher. Words matter. Other thoughts or comments?
I've got a question.
Sure.
It might just be like a geographical niche question, but there's a lot of
Is it the
dispute.
casserole hot dish situation?
I don't know. Well, it's about the word dude, and I'm in Southern California, and we grew up with this word, and it has all these meanings, and it's like exclamatory meanings as well as referring to persons. And but there's a lot of I've seen a lot of debate amongst different friend groups from Southern California about sort of if the word is gendered in different contexts and things like this. Maybe I
Mhm.
don't know if you've seen or heard any of this, or if you're aware of the dude disputes.
Yeah,
Um,
I mean, I think any word can have similar kind of disputes, right? So I am from the super northern part of California, and so my experience with the word dude did not exist until I came to California in a different way than where I grew up, because in California you have dude ranches. And dude ranches are where kind of like lone wolf humans, mostly men, although I have met a number of like wiry, independent lone wolf women who work at dude ranches. But it's kind of like migrant work, not meaning migrant workers working in a farm, but like the lone wolf is in town until they're not in town anymore. There's this kind of romantic drifter cowboy kind of situation that I grew up with, and that was a dude. Like that's how I knew the word dude was somebody who like drifted into town and worked for a little while and left for a little while. So I met a guy recently who referred to himself as a vagabond, which I don't know if that names this drifter dude that I grew up with, but he's like, I'm a baker, and like you can bake in any country pretty much around the world. And so he's worked for like next to nothing or just housing all around the world, baking stuff, and like landed in Eureka, California. So that's to me what dude meant, right? Is this kind of like drifting laborer. So then I moved to California, and dude is like straight out of some like surfer movie. The dude is related to surfers, and it is like brah, right? Like brah is the new dude. And all of them are very masculine. Like you wouldn't dude a woman, unless like it's like the Tom girl, tomboy, I guess is what I was called. So I would be like the one woman friend of a group of guys. So maybe I would be like an honorary dude. I think maybe that exists. But generally it's kind of masculine. Um, and then just the California way of speaking of like dude, which is like questioning all systems that exist in the world, right? Like can be just dude. And that's one of the most creative things about language is it can mean all different kinds of things. I don't know that the meaning of the different meanings, I don't know if they're all like directly linked to systems of oppression and we should never use these words anymore, as much as it is who got to coin the phrase and what does that mean. And when the Great Depression happened and the Dust Bowl in the Midwest happened and people picked up from Oklahoma and Nebraska and Iowa and Texas and moved west and began country western music. Did dude show up there? And so this like I'm off the grid, like maybe that is a link between dude of being like off the grid, yo. I don't know. I have no idea, but it's fascinating. So I don't know if that's in line with kind of Ryan your participation in those conversations or if it's something different.
Yeah, I was just interested in hearing your thoughts, and I'm just sort of interested in it. And like if it, I'm also like trying to follow what's happening. So like if this, it would take some work for me to cut it out of my like speech patterns, I think. And I don't really have a big attachment to it, but I use it a lot. But if it does come to start having certain valences and stuff, I'm just trying to sort of monitor.
Yeah.
Yeah. So
Well,
thank you.
I think the monitoring thing kind of goes back to like a next kind of step of things that you can do. So there are words that we absolutely do not say anymore that were mainstream words, and some of them were cut from mainstream words because they were offensive, and sometimes they just don't work, right? Like I grew up with gag me with a spoon. I have not heard that in decades, but like, ugh, gag me with a spoon. Like, maybe that is like a super white upper class, like, shout out to bulimia. I have no idea, but it was just the way that we said yuck when I was in high school. But we don't say that anymore, right? I haven't heard that being said. So, monitoring what you say, one, doesn't always come with a negative, right? But this may be a word that other people don't know or understand, right? Like dude in Nepali actually means breast. So if you're talking to someone who speaks Nepali, they could be like, why did that come up, right? Like, so, so I mean, you need to be mindful of words that you use, and if they need explanation or if they need editing in given situations, but that doesn't necessarily make them terrible. It just makes part of you. Like one of my favorite sentences is every sentence has a history. And so where you come from, that is a word that is like embedded in your vernacular and it speaks to you and your history. And why don't you get to show up? Right? Like making space for other people doesn't mean you don't get to show up. It just means you need to acknowledge that there might be a gap in understanding there. But
Yeah, thank you.
yeah, sure. Um Definitely heard that one as a kid, had completely forgotten about it. Oh, the gag me with a spoon thing. I used to say you guys to mean everyone, and now I don't because international friends thought I was only talking to men. Yeah, who knew Texas would get something right, but y'all is plural you. That works out great. hmm Great. Noticing is half the battle. And to Carrie's point about dismantling giant systems, noticing where you fit into the systems is, I think, like step 9, because you first have to even realize that that system exists, right? Like me talking about dude ranches may very well to Ryan have been like, what is she talking about? Like, this is it. What? Right? And there are probably dude ranches in California too. And while I was talking about it, I was like, I wonder how many of those vagabonds, to use this word of this baker friend I just met, how many of them were like ex-cons or like people who had a really hard time finding full-time employment and so they were taken in these ranches, or how many of these ranches were the I think they're called halfway houses, like when you get out of drug rehab and you're kind of in this like house with some other folks before like you're trying to like start your life over again, right? Like maybe that was what a dude ranch was. I don't know. Now I have all these like questions about dude ranches, but anything is possible. So
When you
noticing
said it,
your
it made
own.
me think of this show on Nickelodeon when I was a kid called Hey Dude. I don't know if you ever saw that.
I
Oh,
don't remember that show. Hmm, interesting.
I'm gonna
I
head
bet it.
off. Thank you so
I,
much for your time, Jess.
yeah, sure. I bet that show doesn't play in Nepal because it's like, hey, boobs.
Sure of it.
Yeah. It literally means milk, I think. So maybe it's like, hey, milk. Because breast's function is only related to milk.
Fascinating.
Another system to pay attention to. But we're not debunking Nepali masculinity right now. That's a different workshop. Cool. Well, thank y'all very much. I'm gonna head out and stop recording. But if there's anything I can do between now and July, happy to help. So great. Thanks. Bye,
Thank
y'all.
you.
Thank
Thanks,
you,
Jess.
Jess.
Bye.
Bye.